Welcome to the Black and White Photography Podcast, and today we're doing something a little different. We're going to let photographs do the talking. Jim Horn and his guest Ron Cooper are sitting down with a series of stunning black and white images, each one a close-up portrait of hands, tattooed and ringed, clasped in prayer, carving wood, engraving intricate patterns, adorned in henna, hands that carry entire lives in their lines and textures. These images strip away faces and backgrounds and force us to ask what we can truly know about a person, a culture, or a moment from nothing more than the way someone holds their hands. So settle in, because this conversation is about craft, identity, devotion, and what it means to really look.
Well, Ron, welcome to the show. It's good to have you on. And I think the folks are going to be really interested in the photographs you have of it's a series on hands, and it's extremely well done. So, Ron, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? When did you get started in photography?
Well, I've been at it about 16 years or so, and it was really a very serendipitous start for me. I was between jobs and planning to do some travel, and a friend gave me a digital camera. And I took that camera on my travels in South America, and I took pictures of everything I came across: landscapes, nature, cityscapes, architecture, still life, everything but people. I just didn't want to photograph people because it felt to me that if you shot photographs of people with a long lens, it was kind of sneaky and underhanded, and I was reluctant to approach them and ask their permission. And over that period of 16 years, my practice has migrated from that to now photographing exclusively people. When I travel and when I work here in the US, my only photographic subjects are people. And it's been an interesting transition over that period of time. But I would say, particularly over the last dozen or so years, I have met and photographed over 2,000 people in 30 countries around the world.
Wow. You know, it seems like a lot of photographers start out like you did, and I can attest to that. I started many decades ago. You start photographing everything, right? And then all of a sudden there's something that says, you know, I ought to stick with this subject matter rather than run off and do landscape or something like that. That's very, very common. Anyway,
yeah, the epiphany. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the epiphany for me was I was in Moab in Utah to photograph at arches. And as you probably know, and as so many photographers have done, you get up in the middle of the night, it seems, at 3 o'clock in the morning to get out to the park, and you drive out there to stake out your position in front of the arch. And I was flabbergasted when I arrived to find that there were already 40 cars in the parking lot. And when I got out there, after hiking in with my gear, there were an equal number of photographers all set up, everyone essentially attempting to make the same photograph. And I realized at that point that I wasn't a good enough landscape photographer, nor was I patient enough to wait for the light in every instance to be a brilliant landscape photographer. And I did realize that I enjoyed people, and ultimately migrated my photography practice in that direction.
Well, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've got that photo. And there were about 40 photographers out there, and they're all lined up, and you're exactly right. You got to get out there early in the morning if you don't get out there early. And it's rather discouraging, quite frankly, because you think you're usurping everybody, and you're really not. Everybody else is out there, and they're sort of growing crazy. So when you look at your evolution because we always have equipment geeks, and they always want to, know what kind of equipment you're using today. What's your equipment of choice today?
I am a Canon digital photographer, and I have been since the start. I am not particularly technology oriented, and I find that the system that I've been using, as it's evolved from a DSLR to mirrorless, it's just been easy for me to sort of progress along the path as these technologies have made themselves available. More importantly, what I've discovered is I can work pretty effectively when I travel with a pretty light setup. I tend to bring two camera bodies, not that I use them both, but I bring one for backup because when you travel halfway around the world, you don't want a technical failure to intervene with your ability to make pictures. And I typically shoot with a 24-70 2.8 zoom because almost all of my photographs are very tight. I'm right there with the subject, and I can use that 24 if I want to make an environmental portrait, and I can use the 70 end of that lens to make a tighter portrait. When I work in a more controlled environment, I will typically use that lens plus a 85 millimeter f1.2, also the Canon prime lens, which is a brilliant portrait lens, but it's heavy. And when you're traveling and you're hauling gear up and down hills and in areas like the Himalayas where the altitudes are high, carrying that lens is a bit of a challenge. I also carry a backup lens, which is the 24-105, also the Canon lens. And again, just to have that backup. But I find that I'm able to do the kind of photography I do with those lenses, and importantly, a tripod. In almost every instance, when I photograph people, I set the camera on the tripod because it forces me to slow down, to be very deliberate in the way I frame and compose the image. And it also allows me to get out from behind the camera so I can interact with the subject. Because I find when I'm talking to someone, even if we don't speak the same language, I'm finding that interacting with a subject in real time generally yields a much more effective portrait. And so having the camera on the tripod allows me to do that.
Yeah, and I think the tripod, although it's a lot of people misalign it. Unfortunately, I think it shows that you're really serious. If you're going to set up a tripod to take a photograph of somebody, it's not just quick snapshot, going to run over to the next person. It says, hey, I'm really doing this in a professional kind of vein. And I think that's extremely important. I don't, just running off and doing a quick snapshot is not necessarily the best way to enhance yourself. And then getting behind the tripod, getting out in front of the tripod, that's great. Sort of directing the person, right?
Yeah, and I find that I photograph people who, in many instances, have never had their portrait made, and they don't know what to expect. And if I can interact with them more directly, it puts them at ease. And ultimately, I'm able to get maybe a more genuine expression from them. But typically, before I do that, I start with a conversation. I explain to them the kind of work that I do. I have a little card, a 4x6-inch postcard, so to speak, that has maybe 20 examples of portraits that I've made. And I give that to them, and I say, how much I appreciate the time they're giving me and the privilege of making their picture. But I want them to be comfortable, and I want them to know this isn't just one or two frames. When I can, I might try to do 30 or 40 frames over a 20-minute period of time, because ultimately it's those little micro expressions when you're doing portrait photography that result in the difference between an acceptable picture and one that is really outstanding, I find.
Well, wow. Congratulations on the patience and to get someone to sit that long, 20 or 30 minutes, somebody you don't know, somebody you may not speak their language, that says a lot about your being able to be comfortable with people and people comfortable with you. That is really, really great, because that's a hard thing to do, to get people to sit behind the camera. And the postcard idea, that's a great idea, because then that sort of takes away the mystery. What are you doing? And how, I think I think our listeners will be interested in that. Show them a postcard. And how did you, not to get crazy on the postcard, what did you do? Did you go to some printing place to do the postcard and just put the photos on there? Is that what you did?
Yeah, I had a graphic designer actually put it together for me. It was not very expensive. And I sent him perhaps 50 portraits and let him pick 25 that he thought would tell the story that I wanted to tell with a postcard. The other thing on the postcard is my email address, my website, and my Instagram information, because I find I offer in every instance, I offer the opportunity to send people pictures, digital files. But in a lot of places that I go, and I really especially enjoy photographing older people, elders and retirees, and I love wrinkles. Uh, these people oftentimes, particularly in the lesser developed parts of the world, don't have email or they don't have a digital footprint, so to speak. But in many instances, their grandchildren do, and they're often there when I'm photographing grandma or grandpa, and I will give that card to the grandchild. And in many instances, they're able to pull up my Instagram account on the spot on their phone.
Oh, right. That is
It has
great.
been really remarkable to me to see, even in places as far flung as the developing world, cell phones are ubiquitous. And it is stunning just in the last several years how these young kids all over the world who have access to YouTube and TikTok and other apps that run on the cell phone networks have access to American websites and Instagram, and they see our culture. And in fact, just to give you one more anecdote, I was in an area, a rural area of India last fall, about 6 hours west of Calcutta. It was really just a little village, and a bunch of kids in the village, some of them with phones. And when they found out I was from the United States, two of them cornered me right away, and they wanted to know if I personally knew Taylor Swift because their exposure to American culture
Yeah.
on the web is all about popular music and movies and so on and so forth. And they don't really have a well-developed understanding of how all this really works in our culture. And I found it fascinating.
Oh, that is great. What a great story, and what a great idea, the postcards. Anyway, let's get on to some of these great photographs. The skull rings. I like this. Here we go. Can you see that okay? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
So I first of all, when I looked at it, I mean, there's a sense of grittiness here. There's a story someplace, and I think of skulls, and I think of motorcycle guys and gals and so forth. Give us some history behind this photograph. It's well done. For a matter of fact, the texture, the feeling of all these 5 photographs, they're all very, very similar. You would know that Ron Cooper did these photographs. So why don't you talk a little bit about this one?
So this photograph was made in New Orleans, Louisiana, and which is a wonderful place to do people photography and street photography, for that matter. And I was photographing this person, literally just saw him on the street. And that's so often how it works for me. I'm always on the lookout for people that have interesting faces and have potentially interesting stories to tell, who also are approachable. And I approached this individual, introduced myself, told him I wanted to make his portrait, and he was receptive. And I probably shot 15 or 20 frames of him in what would be a typical portrait, head and shoulders and upper body and so on, face. But I noticed as he was rubbing his beard, as I was talking with him and photographing him, his hands were extraordinary, and the jewelry, the rings in particular. And so after I had made his traditional portrait, I asked him just to put his hands in his lap. And I probably made 12 or 15 frames with his hands in various positions. And this was the one that I liked the best. And you hit the nail right on the head. For these kinds of portraits, I think it's critical to capture the textures in the skin. And that helps tell the story of who this person is. And you can see the dirt under his fingernails and on his hands, and you can see the skull rings. And without really knowing anything about it, it tells a story. And that was my objective in these hands photographs, is to try to tell a story and to convey something about the person without necessarily showing their face.
That certainly does it. It certainly does it. Does he have a motorcycle when you were there? I saw the skull rings, and did you see a motorcycle, or that's just
no motorcycle? But he had a dog with him. And if you've been to the French Quarter in New Orleans, there are no shortage of characters walking around the French Quarter to meet and take photographs of, and he was certainly one of many.
Okay, let's go on to the prayer beads. I've spent some time in Vietnam and some of the Buddhist areas and so forth of Southeast Asia. And when I looked at this, that's sort of what I was looking at. I mean, it's interesting on this. The texture, as I said, on all five of these is very similar, but I like the way you highlighted the beads and so forth, and they came out, and then you just sort of gradually go off a little bit darker. So talk about this photograph a little bit.
This photograph was made in Bhutan, which is a tiny little country that geographically sits between India and China. And I met this guy literally on the street near a shrine where he had been praying, and I wanted to make his photograph, but I didn't want to interrupt his prayer. And so I just waited and waited, and maybe 20 minutes later, he was finished doing his religious observation, and I approached him. And in this instance, I was with a driver. I had a driver with me to get me from place to place. And the driver, of course, spoke the local language, which is called Dzongkha, and I didn't, and he didn't speak English. But through the translator, explained that I wanted to make his picture. And again, I started with a traditional portrait, making a picture of his face. But I noticed he was clasping these prayer beads. And this was the very first time I had recognized this opportunity to photograph hands. And so I spent a little bit of time moving him around a little bit to get the light right on the hands, and made a series of photographs of him with the prayer beads. And this is that image that I like the best. When I photograph people for traditional portraiture, as well as for these hands, I do spend a fair amount of time trying to get them located in a place where I can use natural light and I can get the light exactly right. Because as we all know, photography is about light. More than anything else, in my view, it's about light. And so moving people into full shade or into an area where there is some side light that produces more shadow and contrast, whatever the circumstance happens to be, it's worth taking that time to get things set up before you start taking pictures. And I find that I'm more likely to achieve the kind of result that I'm after if I take that moment. And in this instance, you can see that light coming in from our left side across the back of his hand and across the knuckles, and that beautiful reflection, those specular highlights on the beads.
Yeah, that side light is what does it. Frontal light would never do it, but the side light that's absolutely perfect. The wood carver.
Yeah, so this
Once
one,
again, go ahead.
this was in Laos, in one of the markets where these little sculptures, these little carvings are sold. And the guys who were doing the selling are also the ones who are doing the carving. And while they're waiting for customers to come along and bargain to buy these little wood carvings, they're churning out more and more of them. And I was just fascinated by how adept this individual was at carving. I mean, it's just amazing how quickly he can take just a piece of wood, and in a very short period of time, I'm talking about something like 35, 40 minutes, he can get to the point where you see the image itself becoming clear. And, literally he can produce one of these carvings in a matter of an hour or two. And his hands were just moving over the surface of the wood, using the tools. And I thought, wow, that is just beautiful. In this instance, I had to really get him to slow down so that I could use enough depth of field and a fast enough shutter speed at an acceptable ISO to make this frame without movement. And that was a little tricky. I probably shot 30 or 35 frames, and I would say half of them were not usable because of the movement. Now, there are certainly circumstances where movement is part of the picture, but in this instance, I wanted everything to be tack sharp. But ultimately was able to get this, and I was just delighted with this picture because it really shows him at work.
Yeah, once again, it's using this side light that really brings out the texture in his hands. It brings out the texture in the wood carving. It just runs through all of these, And yeah, I would imagine what you said you use Canons now. What model Canons are you using, Ron?
I'm using the latest R5,
R7, R5s, okay.
mirrorless. Yeah.
Okay,
And,
okay.
in these instances, if I can use a tripod, I will. Sometimes to get right on top of the subject, as you see in this image, it's a little trickier to do that. And in those instances, I shoot handheld. But the challenge, obviously, is making sure that there is enough light and that I can keep my ISO typically below 3200 if I can. And typically, to do this kind of work, you need a f-stop north of 8 and ideally even north of 11, because you want to make sure that all of the elements of the frame that you want in that frame are in focus. And so when you're pushing the f-stop that high, obviously you're either going to have to use a low shutter speed or a high ISO. And a low shutter speed is going to result in movement. So you're kind of stuck with a high ISO, which again is why it's so important to get the subject to move someplace where there's adequate light.
Yeah, yeah, I could see using a tripod here would be extremely difficult. And then I could see, because it is you're trying to hold the camera steady and so forth. And like a lot of cameras with the lens, the R5 isn't necessarily light, so you're probably holding your breath just a little bit to get the
exactly.
shot off. Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at the engraver. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so this is in India, in Gujarat province, which is in the western part of India near the border with Pakistan. And this was a family enterprise. The guy is holding what is called a stylus in his hand. They don't use a paintbrush for this. They use a stylus, which effectively is a stick. And they make the inks and the paints out of natural materials, and that's what's in the pot. And he is outlining a very, very meticulously designed piece. It's on fabric, and they go over it with various colors over a period of weeks and weeks and weeks to produce these beautiful wall hangings. And I was absolutely fascinated by the process. Now, here's an instance where I was able to use the tripod. He was working on a table. I had the tripod set up, and he was straight on, as you can see. You can see light is coming from the right side. There was a doorway to the right. And I actually got him to move so that I could make this picture with light coming in from that side with the tripod. And that really worked out quite well. And I made a bunch of different frames, many of which included his face. And you could see in his face this intense concentration. This guy works at this painting with this stylus for hours every day. And it's a very intense process. And it was fascinating to me. But I think by isolating just the hands with a stylus in the subject of his work, it does tell a very interesting story.
Yeah, and I think the story it shows how meticulous he has to be in order to do this. And then getting back to the side lighting, it was able, using side lighting, you could see the it's not really texture on the can he's holding, but you can see it's been smudged. You can tell that can has been around a long time. He's been using it for probably hand-me-downs, right? From years and years.
Yeah. And of course, you can see the detail in the skin on the hands,
right?
Because that side light emphasizes the shadows and the textures, which is really, for this kind of photography, in my mind, it's an essential element.
Yeah, I think if you didn't have that, like we talked about with the front lighting, it wouldn't be anywhere near as good. Okay, let's take a look at the henna hands. Let me see. That, I see a lot of tattoos nowadays. I don't particularly have one, but I see a lot. This is more frontal light a little bit, maybe a little bit down a little bit, I think. And let's talk about these. This is I mean, folks listening to this podcast, you can see all the detail. And I'm assuming it's a tattoo of some kind, Ron. But you can see all the detail as I look at this on the screen. Go ahead, Ron. Talk about it.
Yeah, this is henna, as you said a moment ago. The photograph was made also in India, where there are many, many, many women who decorate themselves with henna, which essentially is a temporary tattoo. And in this instance, her hands were so beautifully elaborated. These designs are meticulous. They are just beautiful. Interestingly, as I was making these photographs, I was thinking these pictures are going to have to be presented in color because the color of her skin was so gorgeous and the color of the henna. And if you look at her sleeves and the jewelry she was wearing, all of it is so spectacular and colorful. And initially, I rendered the picture in color. And I thought to myself, I need to see what this looks like in black and white. And by reducing it to black and white, you're really reducing it to its essence.
Yes.
And the majority of my photography is in black and white. There are certainly subjects and images that have to be presented in color, but seeing this initially in color and then in black and white really persuaded me that the story was better told in black and white. And you can see in the detail how meticulous this work is and how beautiful it is. And you're exactly right. It was lit overhead. So I had her, actually, this was outside. I moved her. She was, when I first met her and started to talk with her about these photographs, she was inside. We moved outside under a tree in open shade. And I was able to get her sitting down, and I was able to get up and over the hands a little bit, as you can see here, which for this particular image is exactly the right angle, because what I wanted to capture here were the designs as well as her hands. And of course, her skin is youthful. It's not wrinkled. It's not gnarly. It's not dirty or tattered like some of these others that I've photographed. And so I wanted this to be lit in a way that allowed me to tell that particular story.
Well, that's really great. You know, there we go. We're back to the full screen shot. You know, the interesting thing in our conversation as you talk about these photographs, what impresses the heck out of me is the fact that you're able to move the subjects around, but you can't speak their language. I think that
Yeah.
is very, very interesting. And it's an ability or a trait, something you're doing that people just feel so comfortable. Like, you know, you said, oh, come on out and move out in the shade, and you can't speak the language. You sort of got a guide her. That's phenomenal. That's a talent that a lot of people don't have, and a lot of people actually might even be afraid to acquire.
Yeah, the key, and I've taught a couple of travel portraiture workshops, and what I tell people is photography is about light. And when you're going to make a portrait of someone you meet in the street, you don't want to waste your time and theirs to make a portrait that is poorly lit or with a distracting or uh, inappropriate background. And so typically, when I'm someplace where I don't speak the language, I'll have someone with me, a driver or a guide, or I'll find a kid who speaks a little bit of English and I'll pay him $5 or $10 to come with me for an hour. And typically, I introduce myself to the subject. I explain exactly what I want to do. And while I'm doing that, I'm thinking, okay, where do we need to go to get great light and a great background? I also carry with me a 5x7 piece of black cloth,
Mm.
fairly dense black cloth. It's not heavy, and a couple of clamps. And if I can't find a suitable background, I can set up that cloth as a backdrop. If I'm shooting a portrait of someone head and shoulders or even upper body, typically that 5x7 piece of cloth is big enough to give me a completely neutral background, so to speak. Now, these days, I guess you can do that in Lightroom and in Photoshop, even if you're
Yeah,
shooting
you knock
against
it
a
out.
different
Yeah.
background. But as a practical matter, getting the right light, getting the right background, uh, having that interaction with the subject, getting them comfortable, in my view, is worth the time it takes. And if I can't find the right light or the right background, I typically won't pursue the picture because why take the time, your time or the subject's time, to come up with something that isn't going to work?
Exactly, especially if you're 14,000 miles or 10,000 miles away, and you want to make it right. If it's not right, why you're right, absolutely right. Why bother doing it? You're better off walking away. I know I walked away from shots that, hey, not really good. Hey, one final question I think the listeners would be interested in is what kind of post-processing do you do nowadays?
Well, as little as I possibly can. I was advised when I first started uh, by some photographers who I admire and whose work is brilliant that you want to make the picture in the camera. And so I try whenever I can to get the composition right. I mean, obviously, there are many, many circumstances where I need to do a little bit of cropping or even perhaps change the aspect ratio from 2:3 to 4:5, for example, something of that nature. Typically, because I favor black and white, I do the conversion in Lightroom. I tend not to use the myriad of Lightroom presets that are available. I tend to do a straight conversion, and then I work with a panel of different features to get exactly what I want in terms of color, using color temperature, which I find adjusts some of the images that I work with, or using things like texture or clarity. But I try to do as minimal a job in processing. And I would say I tend to spend probably no more than 10 minutes on an image doing post processing. Um, I don't use Photoshop. I'm embarrassed to say it. I don't even know how to use Photoshop.
No
Lightroom is
problem.
so comprehensive and so powerful now. I do occasionally use masks in Lightroom, and I have been experimenting with a masking feature that uses AI, and it is brilliant. It is amazing. And so I do that when that's necessary. The other thing that's very important to me in my portraits, it's not obviously relevant in the pictures of the hands, but in the traditional portraits, um, almost all of my portraits, you will see a catch light in the eyes of my subjects. And I do that because I think it creates a sense of life in those
Right.
pictures. So when I'm working on light and positioning, I want to get people positioned so that there are catch lights. And I sometimes will use masking in Lightroom to enhance those catch lights to make sure that when you're looking at this person, you know, you're feeling that real connection. What I want when viewers look at my picture, I want them to say, wow, I'd love to meet that person. I'd like to know
Exactly.
more about that person's life and circumstance. And I think if you compose it properly and you light it properly, your chances of accomplishing that are better.
Absolutely. Oh, I like that little time in post processing because the software, I mean, quite frankly, myself, and I'm sure a lot of listeners, I really don't use Photoshop anymore. I find it's just too much. I think it's more for graphic designers today. Anyway, Ron, listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show. One of the nice things about a gentleman like you coming on the show, showing your work, what it really does is it really inspires photographers. In other words, they get ideas. Okay, maybe it's not the hands, maybe it's something else for them, or just going out and shooting and finding out how you overcame some of the difficulties with shooting portraits. That's all extremely important. And I really appreciate you coming on the show, talking about these things, because this podcast gets worldwide listens and views on YouTube. So, you probably have, walked away today, or you've inspired somebody. If it's one or two people or 100 people, I think that's what's extremely important.
Well, I hope that's the case. And I thank you for inviting me, Jim.
Well, I thank you for being here. You take care, Ron. Have yourself a great time in California.
Thank you.